Morning settles over the chateau with ceremonial calm, light filtering through tall windows, dust floating gently above polished floors, and a young countess sits at a carved desk, posture perfect, expression composed, already fluent in the discipline of appearing attentive while feeling quietly, restlessly unfinished inside. She is born into privilege measured precisely, educated in manners before emotions, a mainstream historical reality for French aristocratic women whose value was refined early through obedience, alliances, and the careful management of silence. Her days are scheduled with lessons meant to shape her mind without awakening it too fully, because curiosity, when sharpened, can become inconvenient, and history has never been kind to women whose thoughts outpace their circumstances. It is said in household law that silence is the first virtue taught to noble daughters, and she learns it well, nodding, listening, absorbing, even as questions gather behind her calm eyes like unsent letters. The tutor arrives quietly, announced without flourish, carrying books rather than authority, and yes, this is one of those moments you probably won't survive easily, because change often enters disguised as instruction. He is educated, precise, careful with words, a man employed to teach knowledge without imprinting himself, a delicate position in a household where intimacy must never appear accidental. Mainstream records show that private tutors were common in noble French homes, often chosen for discretion over brilliance, yet historians still argue whether such proximity inevitably blurred emotional boundaries or merely revealed what structure tried to suppress. He begins with literature, philosophy, history, subjects framed as enrichment rather than liberation, and she listens closely, because this is the first time someone has spoken to her as though her understanding actually matters. There is a quirky superstition among provincial households that knowledge shared in quiet rooms carries greater weight, and perhaps that explains why each lesson feels heavier than it should, settling into her thoughts long after he leaves. She notices his pauses, his restraint, the way he avoids her gaze just long enough to appear proper, and this careful distance feels oddly considerate in a world where most decisions about her life are made without asking. He, in turn, notices her attention, not admiration, but presence, a quality far more dangerous because presence invites recognition, and recognition demands responsibility neither is meant to assume. Their conversations remain formal, but the silence between sentences grows expressive, a shared stillness that begins to feel less instructional and more companionable. Historians still argue whether education offered aristocratic women empowerment or refinement alone, but standing here with her, it already feels like something quieter and more destabilizing is taking root. Outside, the chateau moves on with its rituals, meals, greetings, measured laughter, while inside this room something unremarked begins to form, delicate and persistent, like a thought one is taught not to finish aloud. As the lesson ends, she closes her book carefully, aware that nothing visible has changed, and yet something irreversible has begun, because once silence is shared knowingly, it can never return to innocence. Lessons settle into routine, mornings repeating with measured calm, yet familiarity sharpens awareness rather than dulling it, and she begins to anticipate his arrival the way one anticipates weather, pretending indifference while adjusting posture, breath, and expectation accordingly, without ever admitting it. The tutor structures lessons meticulously, grammar before philosophy, dates before ideas, a mainstream historical method in 18th century France where education emphasized order over expression, though historians still argue whether such sequencing restrained emotion or quietly intensified it within private households of noble estates. She asks questions cautiously, phrasing curiosity as clarification, and he responds with care that borders on tenderness, a dangerous precision, because attention offered gently often feels safer than passion, and therefore travels farther before anyone notices the distance crossed between them. A quirky household belief insists learning shared after noon settles deeper, so lessons drift longer, shadows stretching, and she finds herself hoping clocks misbehave. A small rebellion, yes, but even small rebellions change how silence is experienced within the room together now. He maintains professional distance, standing near the window, voice even, eyes respectful, and this restraint reads as trustworthiness in a household trained to fear scandal, though historians still argue whether restraint protects women or simply protects institutions from consequence after such closeness. Their shared silences become instructional too, pauses used to consider meaning, and she learns that being listened to without interruption can feel like being chosen, which is absurdly intoxicating, she tells herself, with a rueful smile only she notices during lessons sometimes. Mainstream accounts note tutors are expected to remain invisible, yet proximity breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds care, a progression both understand intuitively, prompting him to shorten visits slightly, an adjustment she registers immediately and pretends not to mind at all times. He offers books beyond the syllabus, lending them discreetly, a fringe practice that skirts approval, and she reads at night, heart quickening because ideas arriving without permission can feel like secrets shared, even when printed centuries earlier within borrowed margins alone. They discuss characters and choices, not themselves, a careful substitution that allows emotion to travel safely, and she begins to hear her own thoughts articulated by another, a sensation both validating and frightening in equal measure during lessons often together. A lighter side creeps in when he misquotes a line and blushes, human after all, and she nearly laughs, catching herself because laughter here would invite intimacy, and intimacy would demand explanations the chateau does not forgive easily ever again. He senses the shift and tightens formality, correcting posture, timing exits, a self-check that reads as care, while she practices her own discipline, reminding herself that affection learned through intellect can still wound deeply over time, quietly in that space. Historians still argue whether such bonds were common or exceptional, but the household notices nothing, because propriety is intact, and intact surfaces often conceal the most decisive changes, occurring politely, incrementally, and without witnesses within private rooms' daily routines now. She grows adept at silence that communicates, offering answers that invite follow-up, and this skill, learned quickly, feels like power borrowed temporarily, thrilling and alarming, because borrowed power must always be returned, often with interest by circumstance alone, here alone. Outside lessons, she rehearses restraint, composing neutrality, while inside she keeps a ledger of moments, glances, pauses, each entry precise. Because memory organized becomes manageable, or so she hopes, with practical optimism learned early enough now with care daily there. When the lesson ends, she thanks him formally, and he bows slightly, both aware that instruction has already taught something unintended, something quieter than knowledge, heavier than words, and far harder to set down once lifted together afterward, quietly so. As weeks pass, knowledge settles into familiarity, and familiarity sharpens awareness, until she realizes she's no longer listening merely to learn, but to be present with him, a distinction subtle enough to deny yet heavy enough to reshape how silence behaves between them. Their discussions drift toward moral philosophy, virtue, restraint, the careful architecture of self-control, a mainstream historical preoccupation in pre-revolutionary France, where education often emphasized moderation, while daily life quietly rewarded ambition and inheritance instead. She listens with unusual intensity, because these ideas feel personal now, less abstract than before, and he notices, adjusting explanations, softening examples, careful not to cross into intimacy even as the space between instruction and confession narrows steadily. A quirky household belief suggests that ideas exchanged while seated imprint more deeply than those spoken standing, and so he allows himself to sit once, a small breach of formality that echoes louder than any declaration might have. She notices his hands when he turns pages, ink-stained, precise, and this observation startles her because it has nothing to do with learning and everything to do with recognition, a line crossed internally long before anything visible has occurred. Historians still argue whether emotional intimacy formed through education was accidental or inevitable, but here, inevitability feels less like destiny and more like repetition given meaning, a slow accumulation neither fully acknowledges aloud. They begin finishing each other's thoughts, not sentences, but ideas, which feels intimate in a way language alone cannot explain, because understanding without clarification carries a quiet thrill no etiquette manual prepares one to manage. She becomes cautious, choosing words carefully, aware that ease is now a liability, and he mirrors this shift, introducing distance with deliberate pauses, the way one might place furniture between themselves and a fire that has grown unexpectedly warm. A lighter side escapes her one morning, an observation slightly playful, and she freezes immediately, embarrassed by her own ease, while he smiles briefly, then hides it, because warmth, once revealed, resists containment far more stubbornly than cold. Mainstream accounts emphasize discipline as moral strength, yet historians still argue whether restraint practiced too late intensifies attachment rather than dissolving it, a question playing out silently in the way both now hesitate before speaking. She begins to measure lessons by what is left unsaid rather than what is covered, sensing that silence has shifted from absence into presence, thick with meaning neither intends to test directly. Outside the study, the chateau prepares for social visits, marriages discussed in murmurs, futures negotiated politely, and she feels the contrast sharply, because here thought feels chosen, while elsewhere life is arranged without consultation. He senses the approaching shift, introducing stricter schedules, ending sessions promptly, decisions that read as professional yet land with unmistakable emotional weight, because endings rehearsed in advance rarely feel neutral to those waiting. A fringe note in correspondence from similar households suggests that tutors often left before bonds could form fully, a precaution understood instinctively, and he begins to resemble someone preparing to disappear without explanation. As the lesson concludes, she closes her book more slowly than usual, aware that silence has taught her something irreversible, that understanding another person can become a form of attachment long before affection is ever named. By the time summer settles over the estate, the atmosphere has shifted subtly, like air before a storm that never arrives, and she feels it in the way conversations hesitate, in how lessons now carry a faint tension neither acknowledges aloud. The household grows more attentive, servants lingering at doors, schedules adjusted slightly, a mainstream historical reflex in aristocratic homes where reputation required constant, almost instinctive protection. And historians still argue whether such vigilance prevented scandal or merely postponed it until damage was unavoidable. He arrives one morning with unusual restraint, voice carefully neutral, posture formal to the point of stiffness, and she understands immediately that awareness has reached beyond the room they share, narrowing what was once private into something observed. A quirky provincial belief warns that too much quiet between two people invites suspicion, and now silence, once refuge, feels suddenly exposed, demanding performance rather than shelter. Their discussion remains intellectual, yet meaning strains beneath it because knowledge no longer feels like the point, but the excuse, and both sense the fragility of pretending otherwise without betraying themselves entirely. She notices how he avoids lingering now, how he ends sessions precisely on time, and historians still argue whether such discipline signifies moral resolve or fear, though from her side it feels like preparation rather than correction. Jealousy arrives unexpectedly, sparked not by rivals but by her mother's casual mention of potential suitors, spoken lightly, as though futures could be rearranged without consequence, a reminder of how little agency she possesses beyond this room. He hears of these plans indirectly, through household rhythm rather than confession, and his response is imperceptible yet real, a tightening of formality that reads as withdrawal, because engagement now carries risk neither is equipped to absorb equally. Mainstream moral philosophy of the era prizes restraint as virtue, yet historians still argue whether restraint enforced externally erodes sincerity, and standing here, sincerity feels increasingly endangered by survival. She considers speaking once plainly, then dismisses the thought as indulgent, because confession would demand resolution, and resolution in this household rarely favours those without inheritance or title. A fringe anecdote from letters of the time notes that many such attachments ended without farewell, a fact she now understands viscerally, because endings rehearsed silently feel more devastating than those argued openly. Their final lessons carry an almost ceremonial tone, every word measured, every pause deliberate, and she feels the weight of goodbye settling in without permission, heavy and undeniable. He bows deeper than custom requires at the end of one session, a small breach that startles her, because excess respect can sometimes be more revealing than familiarity. She returns the gesture instinctively, both aware that something essential has concluded without acknowledgement, preserved only through mutual restraint. As he leaves, she remains seated longer than necessary, understanding that silence, once taught as discipline, has now become the lesson that will define her life beyond this room. Autumn arrives quietly, and with it the decision everyone has rehearsed but no one names, because propriety prefers inevitability over explanation, a mainstream historical pattern in aristocratic France, where endings were framed as necessity rather than choice, allowing households to preserve dignity, while quietly dissolving attachments that had grown too meaningful to remain contained. The tutor's dismissal is presented as practical, temporary, even beneficial, phrased in the careful language of reason, and historians still argue whether such departures were genuinely neutral or deliberately timed to prevent emotional exposure once a young woman's education was deemed sufficiently complete for her assigned future. She receives the news with composed gratitude, thanking the adults around her for their consideration, while inside understanding settles with an unfamiliar heaviness, because waiting without hope feels different from waiting without knowledge, sharper, more final, and far more difficult to soften with imagination or denial. A quirky rural belief suggests that lessons ended before winter prevent hearts from lingering too long, and though she does not believe in superstition, she cannot help noticing how conveniently tradition often aligns with emotional avoidance in households skilled at protecting appearances above all else. Their final lesson occurs without ceremony, books opened, voices steady, as though nothing has changed, yet every sentence feels weighted with awareness, because neutrality practiced too carefully becomes its own form of acknowledgement, a shared agreement to preserve order at the expense of truth. He does not explain, she does not ask, and historians still argue whether silence in such moments reflects mutual respect or structural coercion. Though standing here, the silence feels less chosen than inherited, passed down through generations as the safest possible response. When the session ends, he bows with exactness, neither more nor less than required, and she mirrors him perfectly, both participating in a ritual designed to prevent memory from acquiring language capable of demanding accountability afterward. He leaves the chateau without farewell, not cruelly, but efficiently, because efficiency is how systems avoid reflection, and she watches from a window she is not meant to linger at, committing the shape of absence to memory with quiet precision. The household resumes its rhythm immediately, meals served, conversations redirected, and she realizes with calm clarity that this seamless continuation is the true lesson she was always meant to learn. By nightfall, she understands that silence has finally been taught completely, not as discipline, but as destiny, and she accepts it with the steadiness expected of her, even as something irretrievable settles permanently behind her composed expression. Winter settles over the estate with disciplined regularity, frost tracing the edges of windows, corridors growing quieter, and she feels time shift again, not forward, but inward, a mainstream historical rhythm for noble women whose lives narrowed after education ended and expectation began. Her days are filled with preparation now, visits, conversations, measured appearances, each one gently guiding her toward a marriage arranged with care and advantage, and historians still argue whether such unions offered security or simply formalized the surrender of personal interior lives. She performs well, praised for composure and maturity, though inside she notices how easily silence now answers questions before she has time to form them, a skill learned too thoroughly to undo. A quirky belief among provincial women suggests that winter stillness preserves memory more clearly, and she experiences this sharply, recalling his voice with unsettling precision, the cadence of explanation, the pauses that once felt like invitation rather than caution. He writes once, briefly, formally, a letter of thanks for the household's generosity, never addressing her directly, yet the restraint feels deliberate, and historians still argue whether such letters were acts of closure or avoidance shaped by unequal consequence. She reads it carefully, folds it, and stores it among her books, because paper placed beside learning feels appropriate, a way to frame memory as something intellectual rather than emotional, safer, easier to justify. She does not reply, not from indifference, but because response would reopen a rhythm she's already been instructed to survive without, and survival, once rehearsed daily, becomes resistant even to longing. Outside, snow deepens, the world narrowing into repetition, and she understands that waiting has changed form again, no longer oriented toward return, but toward endurance without expectation, a quieter but heavier labour. Historians still argue whether women in her position experienced loss consciously or gradually, yet standing here, loss feels unmistakable. Not dramatic, but persistent, a low pressure shaping every decision thereafter. By the time spring approaches, she realizes that silence no longer feels empty. It feels inhabited, structured, and permanent, the final lesson fully absorbed, shaping her future with an efficiency that leaves no visible mark but alters everything all the same. Years pass without ceremony, marked by marriages announced, children born, alliances secured, and she moves through these milestones with practiced grace, a mainstream historical trajectory for women of her class whose personal histories were expected to dissolve seamlessly into family narratives larger than themselves. She becomes a countess in full, hosting, advising, managing estates, praised for composure and insight, and historians still argue whether such authority compensated for the quiet surrender of inner lives shaped earlier by restraint and unspoken loss. There is a quirky habit among aristocratic women of keeping early notebooks long after their usefulness ends, and she keeps hers carefully, pages yellowing, margins filled with thoughts that feel strangely distant yet unmistakably hers. She hears of the tutor only once more, mentioned casually in conversation as having taken a modest academic position elsewhere, and the ordinariness of the news surprises her, because memory had rendered him larger, more consequential than history ever would. She does not react, not outwardly, because reaction would require explanation, and explanation has never been encouraged in a world that values continuity over introspection, a preference historians still debate as cultural stability or emotional austerity. Sometimes, late at night, she recalls a particular pause in his voice, a moment of shared understanding without language, and this recollection feels gentler now, no longer sharp, because time has softened the edges without erasing the shape. A fringe observation in private letters of the era suggests that women often measured their lives against early attachments rather than later marriages, and she recognizes the truth of this quietly, without bitterness, as something factual rather than tragic. Her marriage functions well, respectfully, predictably, and she fulfills its expectations without resentment, understanding that fulfillment and happiness are not identical measures, a distinction rarely acknowledged publicly yet widely lived privately. Historians still argue whether emotional resolution requires confession, but her life suggests another possibility. That resolution can emerge through acceptance, repetition, and the quiet dignity of having endured without disruption. As she ages, silence no longer feels imposed but familiar, even protective, and she carries it with her not as loss but as structure, the final inheritance of an education that taught her exactly how much could be felt without ever being spoken aloud. History does not preserve their names together, which feels appropriate in a world that recorded lineage more carefully than interior truth, because French archives favour marriages, titles and property over moments of recognition that left no official trace, and historians still argue whether such omissions reflect indifference or deliberate cultural design. The tutor fades into footnotes, if he appears at all, his influence reduced to curriculum and credentials, while a fringe belief among educators of the era suggests that the most effective teachers are those who vanish before attachment can complicate instruction. She remains visible, respected, composed, her life unfolding exactly as expected, and those who know her only through reputation would never suspect how deeply silence once shaped her understanding of intimacy, restraint, and the cost of knowing oneself too clearly too early. They never meet again. Not because reunion is forbidden outright, but because structure succeeds where desire hesitates, arranging distances, obligations, and schedules so precisely that chance itself is quietly neutralized without drama or resistance. Sometimes she imagines speaking one honest sentence aloud, then smiles faintly at the thought, because honesty, when delayed too long, becomes unnecessary rather than impossible, a realization that feels oddly peaceful rather than tragic. Historians still argue whether love that remains unacted upon deserves the name, but standing here at the end, the question feels academic because absence has shaped her life with a certainty no declaration could have matched. A quirky observation from later moral essays suggests that education leaves its deepest mark not in knowledge retained, but in habits of thought preserved, and this story fits that truth with unsettling clarity. In the end, nothing collapses, no scandal erupts, no vows are broken aloud, and yet something irreversible has occurred because silence has not erased love, only transformed it into discipline, memory, and a life lived correctly rather than freely. The chateau settles into evening once more, corridors dimming, voices lowering, routine smoothing the sharpness of memory into something almost kind. Stories like this do not ask to be resolved. They ask to be understood without correction, to be held gently where they cannot be changed. She lives on as composure, as continuity, as a life that never disrupted the order it was designed to preserve. He survives as influence without attribution, a voice folded into habits of thought rather than recollection. And that is all right. Not every truth demands recognition to remain real. If you're listening now, let the quiet linger. Let the pauses stretch without filling them. Some loves arrive only to teach us how deeply we can feel without ever crossing the line into declaration, and how much of life is shaped not by what we claim, but by what we learn to carry. Breathe slowly. Let the images soften. Let silence return to being shelter rather than loss. End of script. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. May everything unfold kindly for you.